But dinosaurs had they had air sacs in their bodies, they had air spaces in their bones. With birds, they went even further than that so they could get airborne.
But a horse isn't that big, and 100's a lot.
Would you fight a horse?
I would fight a duck size. I would fight a horse duck, a duck horse. Welcome to our first AMA. Over the past week, Jack and I put out a call on our social channels asking people to ask us anything. And we're going to read a few of those questions and answer them for people today.
All right, let's jump right in. What do you got for us, Greg?
Hi, Jack. Longtime reader and fan from Hong Kong here. Hope you're well. I'm curious why watchmakers don't implement the slipping bridle that's in self-winding movements in manually wound ones. Seems like it would prevent a lot of accidental user-inflicted damage to the watch.
As the question points out, the slipping bridle is basically there so that a fully wound automatic watch, the automatic winding system will still continue to operate even if the mainspring is fully wound. And I think what a lot of people like to have in a manual wind watch is they like to have some sort of tactile indication that the watch is actually fully wound and they can stop winding. So as you wind up a manually wound watch, as anybody who's ever wound one up knows, you feel increasing tension in the mainspring, and then you finally come up against a hard stop where you can't wind the watch any further. Now, practically speaking, I don't think mainspring breakage from overwinding is really an issue in modern watches. Modern mainspring alloys are too strong. The tactile indication that you've reached the limit of winding is something that I think naturally and automatically stops everyone in their tracks. So there's no real need for it. Now that said, I believe that there are instances of modern watches where slipping bridles have been installed despite the watch being hand wound as a way of avoiding excessive tension in a very long mainspring. And my memory is not kicking to the surface any particular examples right now, but if I think of when it would actually make sense to have a slipping bridle in a hand-wound watch, it would tend to be in a situation like that where the tension in the mainspring is so high because of its length, because of its strength, because of an extra long power reserve, that you would actually want to have some sort of leeway. In a manually wound watch, you actually get a little bit of let off from tension when you fully wind it because the click spring in hand wound watches usually lets you pull up against a hard stop, and when you let go of the crown, it actually slides back a little bit. Because in a manually wound watch, one of the things you don't want is you don't want the mainspring coils actually touching each other when the watch is fully wound, because the friction against them will cause some upsets in precision and some upsets in accuracy. So you don't really need it from a precision standpoint, and because of modern mainspring alloy developments, you don't really need it to prevent breakage either.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much for that response.
Sure. Top of mind for a lot of folks, what are your thoughts on the new Universal Geneve pieces? The prices seem steep, but I think the movements look promising. Oh, that's the dilemma, isn't it? That's the eternal dilemma of the watch collector.
That's always the dilemma when it comes to watchmaking. I actually have some strong feelings on the UG pieces that came out. When it was first announced, I had the privilege of interviewing some of the people that Breitling and Georges Kern actually used to consult with. So the whole UG crew, I ended up talking to them early on in the process before they even got to the releases. And one of the things that has come up so often in this conversation is the price point. However, from the jump, Georges Kern and Breitling and the newly formed group over there,
they knew there was some expectations managing that they would have to do.
Yeah, but they said it from the beginning that these were going to be that upper tier, above Breitling price point. And I know there's competition in that price point. It's a very competitive area. However, I do think they created watches that fit that price point. They are high quality. They did a great job at going through the proper design cues and pulling from really interesting models from the UG collection.
Including the Cabriolet, which was kind of everybody's surprise hit.
Yeah, the Cabriolet, absolutely gorgeous. I love the Disco Volante that they came out with. I just thought it was something totally different, kind of retro, but it had the modern movement in it. And I also, just talking about the movements a little bit, with the pole router, however we want to say it today, The micro rotor was a big aspect of that, and they increased the size of the micro rotor on the new versions that are out today, and I love it. I think it was the right move.
It was certainly the right move from an engineering standpoint.
Yeah, it allowed for them, I think, to take what was already a classic, an icon, and aesthetically it's pretty much the same as the originals, minus some material changes.
Yeah.
But design-wise, and also excluding the bracelet, which I do actually really appreciate the bracelet that they utilized. But it elevated the movement, the accuracy of the movement, and to me, I think that was the right way to go. So I'm actually a fan. I don't think the price point bothers me. I love the designs. I would say if I have any gripe, because I always have to have a gripe, is that they've released the entire catalog all at once. 30 plus watches all at once is a lot. And it's not unprecedented, it's not unheard of for a brand to do that. And I think I understand the philosophy behind wanting to do that, kind of get it all out and then be able to build from there.
Yeah, I mean, doing it that way presents an overall cohesive. It's an overall cohesive presentation of what the vision for the new brand is than it would have been if they just released just Nina Rintz or just pull rotors.
Yeah.
Some of the points that you are making have been noted by some other folks as well, and there's Pointless Complication on Substack.
Mm-hmm.
There's an article by somebody who goes by Velocifile, and his. The article is paywall, but I think he makes some several. I'll paraphrase a little bit. I think he makes some very good points. One of which, is that Universal Genève, in its original incarnation, was actually a luxury watch brand.
Yeah.
These were not well priced for the proletariat utilitarian watches by any stretch of the imagination. They were marketed often in the same marketing environment as as Patek Philippe.
Yep.
So these were not actually. What a lot of collectors perceive them as because of the price structure when people first started noticing Universal Genève as collectors, right? These are not bargains relative to their quality. It's a relaunch of what was in its time a luxury watch brand, and the argument there is that the price given the current market for luxury watches, and also given the original market position of Universal Genève, actually makes more sense than it would have made to try to release watches that appeal to a group of collectors who were interested in vintage UG and who held out hope against hope that the price structure of the new ones would reflect the price structure of the collectibles.
I mean, you can't expect them to come in at the same price of the vintage UG collection.
You can't, but hope springs eternal, and
does.
the larger experience that a lot of collectors have had over the last 10 years is being disenfranchised from things they love because of price increases.
I know, and I know we are exhausted collectively about always talking about price, but I do think, when you take a step back, I can't argue price on this. I think they made a watch that is complementary of what they are charging for it. And for me, it's what's gonna be interesting is the next step with Galette. And what they do with Galette and honoring those vintage chronographs that made them so famous, it's going to be interesting because that's supposed to come in at that lower price point below Breitling, and those are going to be your steps. Galette, Breitling,
so accessible mid-tier.
Exactly. And that to me is going to determine the ultimate success of this, how they come with that lower tier. I don't know if I want to phrase it that way, but that lower tier is going to really set up where UG, in my opinion, is going to go from here.
Solid.
I don't know. Jack, how many death threats have you received for your admiration of Quartz watches?
Fewer than you might think, more than you might hope if you had high expectations of the fundamental goodness of the human spirit. Of course, the question is a little bit facetious. I actually haven't received a single death threat about Quartz watches in particular, certainly. But it does point out something interesting, which is the degree to which we define ourselves as enthusiasts, as connoisseurs, and as collectors by what we reject. So we define ourselves very strongly by what we accept. We define ourselves also very strongly by what we have absolute feelings about in the other direction. And there was a time years ago when when the most fundamental distinction that collectors made was whether or not a brand produced movements in-house or whether they were using supplied movements. And the luxury brands really got on board with this idea. They spent a lot of money and they worked very hard to develop what, in some cases really are extraordinarily beautiful movements that were not available from an outside supplier. So, I mean, one of the classic examples is obviously the Longanzona datograph movement. Just in general, it's universally acknowledged to be one of the, I think it's universally acknowledged. There might be somebody out there who thinks it's ugly as hell, but I've never heard that opinion.
Met them.
No, I've never met them, and indeed may never meet them.
I don't want to.
But so that divide was really important for a lot of people for a very long time. We take a more nuanced view of it, I think, these days. But Quartz always bad that is a very, very strongly held belief for an awful lot of collectors, and especially for folks who are sort of new to the watch collecting space. Mm-hmm. It's less a rejection per se than it is a reflection of their joy in the discovery of the pleasure to be found in mechanical watches.
Yeah, I think with Quartz specifically, I mean, there's so much commentary and conversation around Quartz, their role within the collecting sphere, but I see understanding and appreciation for Quartz is a sign of horological maturity. The same way you used to say it about appreciation of escapements and understanding of escapements is a sign of growing in horological maturity, and I think there's something about Quartz. There's a bit of a bell curve, right? Yeah. When you come in, you're kind of immediate. It's usually your first introduction to a watch is through a Quartz watch,
right.
And then you kind of move away. You're like, oh no, mechanical only, and then eventually you come back.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think part of the issue with Quartz is that I think it's easier to intuitively understand how a mechanical watch works than it is to understand how a Quartz watch works. And while the fundamentals are the same, right? Both have oscillators. I mean, a Quartz oscillator it's an electrically driven mechanical oscillator, but it's still a mechanical oscillator. There are people out there who are high accuracy Quartz enthusiasts and who really delve deeply into how the electronic management systems for these things have evolved. And they sometimes make wonderful discoveries. There's a guy who just started very recently posting on Substack under, I think his Substack is called Precision Watch Reviewer, something similar. And he's been posting stuff that he has an ability to articulate clearly and to make palpable the excitement to be found in appreciating the sophistication of high accuracy Quartz movements that I've really found in very few other places. Mm-hmm. Partly because, there's certainly discussion forums out there for HAQ Quartz enthusiasts, and I don't spend a ton of time on them, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. I think a wider appreciation of what Quartz means and a wider understanding of how sophisticated some of these mechanisms are and their place in the evolution of modern watchmaking I think it's starting to develop. And if there's one indication that Quartz is appreciated now in a way that it wasn't, say, 10 or 15 years ago, I think there's a watch by F. Bjorn, which is a Quartz watch, which I think has become an extremely desirable timepiece to collectors.
The Elegantes have been exploding everywhere.
Yeah.
It's
And
really
it's not holding anybody back that it's a Quartz watch.
No, not one bit. And then on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you see this boom of mecha quartz being utilized with a lot of the micro brands out there. Furlan Mari being the first one that jumps to mind, and their chronographs using the mecha quartz movement. I think that it's to a degree just a new term instead of just saying quartz. I understand the nuances of it. But it's a bit of a marketing tactic to kind of change the perception to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, they do function differently and they feel different from pure Quartz chronographs. The Citizen Watch Company has been making mecha Quartz chronograph movements for many, many years. Yeah. I own a couple. They are, when you're operating them, it feels like a mechanical chronograph because the chronograph switching system is mechanical.
Yep.
The timekeeping system, the time base is Quartz. But it's the feel of the pushers in general is indistinguishable from a mechanical chronograph.
And to finish up this segment, I am just curious, what is your favorite Quartz watch that you own?
My favorite Quartz watch that I own, oh boy, that's tough. I have a few favorites. I have an ultra-thin Citizen Quartz watch, which is the thinnest light-powered watch ever made.
Oh.
Really, really beautiful, very, very elegant, very, very thin, very beautiful watch. I don't laugh, but one of my favorite Quartz watches is a G-Shock. And
Sorry. That's a knee slapper.
Well,
you told me not to laugh.
No. You know what? Let it out. This is a safe space.
We're good.
It's a G-Shock Frogman.
Oh, okay.
With a tide graph on it, and I go out in the mornings every morning for a walk along the East River with my oldest son, and the East River has a very interesting tidal pattern. It's called a river, but it's not actually. Well, I'm not going to do a data dump on tidal bores versus rivers because this is neither the time nor the place. But being able to see the tides corresponding to what the tide graph indicator says on a watch is a ton of fun.
Yeah.
So and I have not actually gotten around to owning one because they've gotten nightmarishly expensive, but I would love to own a Citizen Caliber 001, the most accurate wristwatch of any kind ever made, with a precision of 1 second plus or minus per year. And Citizen's not making them anymore. I get the sense that they're thinking about rolling out an updated version of the technology, but they're trading for multiples over what they sold for, and that was like a $4,000 watch when it first came out.
No, I remember when it came out. Well, you heard it here.
Greg?
Yep, that's
What
me.
are your views on the rise and fall of the independents? What explains the meteoric rise of some independents, and has this happened before? What factors might drive a correction?
It's interesting with this question. One of the parts of it that jumped out to me is, has this happened before? And when I think about the watch and clock world, everyone used to technically be an independent. When you think about Mudge and Tompion and Breguet, all the way back to those founding fathers, Harrison, they're technically all independent watchmakers. So yes, this has happened before. In my opinion anyways, the foundation of watches starts from independence.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, the aggregation of watch brands under sort of larger holding companies started to happen in Switzerland in the 1920s and 1930s with the development with the somewhat nationalization of the watch industry and the development of the cartels. But in the United States, even the very biggest companies like Elgin and Waltham, these were independent, and that was part of the problem with the American watchmaking industry. Because there was no wider industrial base as there was in Switzerland, which happened partially as a result of the development of the cartel system in Switzerland. When the technology to make watches in America was lost with the closure of Elgin, with the closure of Waltham, with the transfer of Hamilton entirely in its manufacturing to Switzerland, we really lost a huge body of knowledge, and people are trying to bring it back.
Yeah.
Obviously in the United States, like Shapiro, for instance. Yep. But it's proven very difficult to do, not because the technology is so exotic, but simply because the manufacturing base is not there, and a lot of the institutional knowledge is gone.
Yeah, and thinking about the modern rise. So when we get to people like Berneron, Rexep Rexepi, Jorn, technically independent,
De
Bethune. But when we get to looking at them, I think it was inevitable. So the rise of the independent to me was an inevitable aspect, and I guess outcome of the use of social media and the internet today and our constant communication, constant contact. People want to have a connection to the creator of the object that they're buying, right? You're never gonna buy a piece of artwork, or I would think you would not buy an expensive piece of artwork unless you have some type of connection, affiliation, understanding of that artist, what they were going through when they created that artwork.
Yes, and I think it's very, very interesting that folks in the tech industry who can afford it and who've become interested in watch collecting in recent years, they're not gravitating towards watches that are designed by AI. They're not gravitating towards watches that have been designed by some sort of automated machine process. They're gravitating towards watches with a very, very strong human presence behind them, by folks like Denis Flageolet, like Roger Smith.
Yep.
These are Philippe Dufour. I mean, these are the folks who have built their lives on the ability of technology to assist and in some cases partly supplant the human creative process. These are the watches that these folks are going for.
I mean, Zuckerberg had on a George Daniels the other night.
Yeah. I mean, a perfect case in point.
Yeah.
And I think that this reflects what is sort of, to me, is sort of an emerging trend in the luxury industry in general. I use AI for research purposes. I think it's absolutely endlessly fascinating technology. The questions that it raises are not within the scope of this particular discussion. But one trend in the luxury industry is there's a philosophical viewpoint in some parts of the luxury industry that AI has its purposes. There are places in which it's very useful, everything from supply chain management to CRM software. But what people want is more actual human connection, not less.
Yeah.
And I think that's a trend that's going to become even stronger. And I think that luxury brands that rely on AI excessively for their communications materials, that rely on AI excessively to manage and create the interface that they have with their clients, I think that that's going to seem less and less desirable over the next few years. Well, that's my hope anyway.
Yeah,
because I want to keep my job.
Yeah, exactly. But you always see the pendulum swing back. Right, we started with this, foundation of independence. Everyone moves towards the brands, what's trendy, and then things move back. Now, my question to you, though, to follow this up, is what are the potential pitfalls of this? Because you hear a lot of conversation around allocation, especially when it comes to independence.
Right.
And a lot of times you see it happening, like people being allocated with their inner circles. So how do people, yes, there is that desire to have that connection with that independent, and I think to your point about social media, people are now gravitating away to have more human connection.
So there are a bunch of potential issues, potential problems, and I emphasize potential because these are not issues that the most successful independent watchmakers necessarily face, or if they're facing them, they're managing them well. The first is the danger of the relationship with someone you want to relate to as a creator becoming too transactional. So if the waiting lists get too long and the prices get too high, at some point the conversation starts to be about how much I paid and how long I had to wait instead of how wonderful the watch is. And that's really, really dangerous because it goes against the whole focus of value in independent watchmaking, which is that it represents human creativity and a closer connection than you can get in industrial watchmaking to somebody who actually creates the pieces. Second possible problem is simply maintenance. The use of unusual materials, the use of unusual designs, unusual gear configurations, unusual escapements. These are all things that make it more challenging to keep a watch serviced and running. And if you're somebody who's interested in a watch made by a particular watchmaker because they're innovating in the world of escapements, but they're using, say, some version of the Breakage échappement naturel, which requires Liga fabrication in order to work. A watchmaker at his bench is not going to make a Liga fabricated component, right? This is an industrial process. Same with the use of silicon. And even without those considerations, spare parts supply can be difficult. And the smart independent brands that are producing watches in volume, which Genève is not doing, but they invest not only in producing the watches, but in also making sure that they have spare parts for servicing those watches, if not for the entire foreseeable future, at least for a reasonable period of time moving ahead. So, and what man has made, man can fix, theoretically, but there may be practical considerations that make it impractical. And it doesn't need to be even exotic components. I mean, there are many, many beautiful vintage watches, interesting vintage watches out there now, which are extremely difficult to repair because the spare parts aren't there. So I would say credibility is one problem. Practicality is another problem. And market oversaturation, I think, is another potential problem. Now, if you're making hand-finished watches in very small numbers, market saturation is probably less of an issue. Yeah. But the sheer volume there were 90 brands showing outside the Palais Expo at the Villa Saracen next door at Time to Watches. Yeah. And I think most of those, if not all of them, were arguably, quote-unquote independent brands. That's an awful lot. The Louis Vuitton watch prize for independent creatives had, the number is really, really big, but it's been hundreds of applicants in both iterations of the watch prize. So there's an awful lot going on out there, and a certain number of these brands are brands that are creating watches because it feels like it's being done a little bit opportunistically and not out of a genuine love for watches or genuine desire to innovate and design. So that's another credibility problem. It's a market saturation problem. And from where I'm sitting, I think about these a lot. These are the three biggest issues, I think, in the independent space in general. The first is the growing credibility gap, which really has to be carefully managed by everybody. Yeah. The second is market saturation, and the third is repairability. So boom, boom, boom.
Awesome. Well, you heard it here. That's our answer to our AMA.
Yes, our first, but hopefully not our last, because there were quite a few unanswered questions. And if you didn't see yours answered now, stay tuned, because we're going to do this again, and hopefully very soon. So thanks, Greg.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Time.
Appreciate it.
See you next time.
Yep. And for our bonus footage, 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?
Somebody actually asked that. A horse-sized duck is basically a dinosaur, because hear me out, ducks are avian dinosaurs.
100 of those little dudes with those chompers, those big teeth, and a little kick, a back kick. You ever have a toddler kick you in the shin?
We're talking about a duck the size of a horse.
A duck the size of a horse.
Duck the size of a horse.
Or 100 horses the size of a duck. Like, what's it doing? Like, it's not gonna stomp. Have you
ever had a duck or a goose come at you? They can come at you faster than you can.
A mama goose and I had a bad relationship.
I would reach down and I would kill 1 duck-sized horse and use it as a club. That's what I would do. That's my solution.
Hi, I'm Tim of the 1916 Company, announcing our all-new 1916 Company app. Check out our all-new community features, including wrist time, where you can log the watch you wear, how often you wear your watches, and see a graphical representation of how you use your collection. But wait, there's more, because this wrist time feature allows you to post in real time to our live feed of user wrist shots. Our community functions also include professionally moderated discussions, all sorts of views, debate, insights into what people want to say about the watches of our times, and all your favorite features are coming back, including media, editorial from Jack Forster, video from yours truly. You can continue to build your online collection and your wish list, plus all the commercial features are back. Buy, trade, and sell through the app, browse our global inventory of pre-owned and new watches. A wrist shot could begin the process of a trade or a purchase. Find the 1916 Company app on the Apple App Store and Google.